My name is Andrew Cole. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, fishing was the only thing that ever made the world feel quiet. I've lived in the same rural town for over a decade now, a place most people wouldn't even recognize by name. No tourist traps, no billboards, just long stretches of road-thick forests and silence that settles in once the sun goes down. Behind my house, past a narrow dirt trail that cuts through the woods, there's a lake, not the kind you see on postcards. No docks, no cabins, no signs pointing the way. It doesn't even have an official name. I always called it Hollow Lake. It's hidden deep enough that you wouldn't stumble across it by accident. You had to know exactly where to walk, which turns to take, which fallen logs to step over. That was part of what I loved about it. No people, no noise, no interruptions, just water trees and whatever thoughts you brought with you. I'd been fishing there for as long as I'd lived in town. Long enough that it felt like my place. Long enough that I trusted it. That trust is why I used to leave my kayak there. It was heavy, thick plastic, the kind that wouldn't tip over in the wind. I'd lean it against the same massive oak tree every time, just a few feet from the shoreline. I always kept it covered, weighted down, so animals couldn't crawl inside. Dragging it back and forth to the house felt pointless. Nobody ever came out there anyway. At least, I thought nobody did. That evening started like dozens of others. Late summer. Warm air clinging to my skin even as the sun dipped lower. The lake reflected the sky in dull shades of orange and purple. I'd already been out on the water for about an hour. The trout were biting. 3 of them sat on ice in my cooler, good size too. Enough to make the trip worth it. I remember thinking how calm everything felt. Too calm. Dusk crept in, slowly shadows stretching long across the surface of the water. The tree line darkened until it looked like a solid wall closing in around the lake. I was just about to head back when I heard something, a noise from the far edge of the lake. At first, I assumed it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a branch breaking under its weight. Then I saw movement. Someone stood near the shoreline, partially hidden by the trees. They were holding something large, a barrel. I stopped paddling and watched. The person tipped the barrel forward, and liquid began pouring into the lake. It flowed thick and steady, spreading outward in slow ripples. Even in the fading light, I could tell something was off. The liquid was dark, unnaturally dark. It looked red. I felt my stomach drop. Before I could think better of it, I shouted across the water, "Hey, what are you doing?" The figure froze. They lifted their head and looked straight at me. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could feel their attention lock onto me, like I'd stepped into something I wasn't meant to see. Then they ran. They disappeared into the woods, leaving the barrel behind, still pouring whatever it contained into the lake. I stared at the water. The dark liquid spread beneath the surface, dissolving slowly like it belonged there. A cold, crawling unease settled deep in my chest. I didn't wait. I paddled back toward shore as fast as I could. The woods felt different when I stepped out of the kayak. Quieter, heavier. I pulled my gear out quickly. Rod tackle box cooler, my hands clumsy and tense. As I started covering the kayak, I heard it, a sharp snap, like a twig breaking under a shoe. Close, too close. I turned my head slightly, about to call out, and stopped myself. Something told me not to speak, not to look. I finished covering the kayak faster than I ever had before. Didn't bother propping it against the tree, just left it on the ground. I grabbed my gear and started walking. Fast, the trail back felt longer than usual. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, convinced someone was behind me. Following, watching. By the time I reached the road leading to my house, my heart was hammering in my chest. I locked my front door the second I stepped inside. I had never locked it that fast before. I cleaned the trout without really thinking, my mind still stuck on the lake, the barrel, the way that man had looked at me. I reheated leftovers, barely tasting them. Then came the knock, firm, deliberate. My blood went cold. I stood still in the kitchen, staring toward the front door. My lights were on. My car sat in the driveway. Whoever was out there knew I was home. Another knock. The microwave beeped loud in the quiet house. Almost immediately, there was a tap on the window. A man's voice followed. "Excuse me, I think you saw me at the lake earlier." My chest tightened. "I just want to explain myself." The voice was calm, too calm. I didn't open the door. I shouted back, "Leave, or I'm calling the police." There was a pause. Then the voice again, steady and patient. "Sir, if you could just open the front door, I can explain everything." Every instinct in my body screamed danger. I repeated my threat. This time, there was no response. I locked every window, turned on the air conditioning, and called the non-emergency police line. Making the report helped just a little, enough that I eventually fell asleep. At around 2 a.m., the sound of shattering glass ripped me awake. I grabbed my gun and moved behind my dresser, aiming at the bedroom door. Slow footsteps creaked up the stairs, measured, controlled. The doorknob turned. The door opened. A silhouette stepped into my room. I flicked on the lamp. The man raised his hands. That's when I saw the blade in his grip. I screamed for him to drop it. He didn't argue. He just said calmly, "I'm leaving," and ran. I thought the nightmare had reached its peak. I was wrong, because this wasn't the first fishing story like this in my family, and it wouldn't be the last. I didn't sleep after that night. Not really. I sat on the couch until dawn, the TV on low volume, my gun resting on the coffee table where I could see it at all times. Every sound outside made my shoulders tense. Every shadow near the broken window felt like it was leaning closer. By morning, my brothers came over to help board up the glass. One of them stayed with me for a few nights after that. We didn't talk much about what had happened. There wasn't much to say. The police never found the barrel, never found the man. And eventually, life did what it always does. It moved on. But something inside me didn't. I stopped going to Hollow Lake, stopped fishing altogether for a while. And that's when my father finally told me his story. Not all at once, not easily. My dad's name is Richard Cole. He's not a man who scares easily. He grew up on the water, raised 3 kids, worked through injuries and loss without ever really slowing down. Fishing wasn't a hobby for him. It was a part of who he was. When he talks about the past, his voice is usually steady, except when he talks about that night. It happened long before I was born, back when my dad was in his early 30s, fishing with his younger brother Thomas, and 3 close friends from college, Neil Bryan and Walter. They had planned the trip for weeks, a remote coastal inlet several hours from the nearest marina. A place they'd been to before, tucked away behind cliffs and dense forest. Hard to reach, easy to lose yourself in. That was the appeal. They left before sunrise, the boat slicing through calm water as mist hovered just above the surface. My dad described it as peaceful, familiar, almost comforting. They anchored in a narrow cove, surrounded by trees that leaned inward, their branches angling overhead like ribs. The fishing was good, too good. Bass, the occasional pike. Enough to keep them laughing, drinking, and losing track of time. Walter cracked open beers early as usual. Bryan followed. By midday, half the boat was buzzed. As the sun dipped lower, the fog rolled in, not gradually. Suddenly, it crept across the water, like something alive, swallowing the boat inch by inch, until the shoreline disappeared completely. Neil, the most experienced among them, kept saying he'd never seen fog like that. Not there. Not ever. They decided to wait it out. But it didn't lift. It thickened. By the time darkness fell, visibility was down to almost nothing. Thomas tried to navigate them out, but nearly clipped the shore. He killed the engine before risking more damage. They were stuck. No signal. No way out. So my dad made a call. He said he'd go ashore to try and find higher ground. Maybe get reception. Neil and Brian went with him. Thomas stayed behind with Walter, who was already half passed out. Before leaving, my dad grabbed the emergency flares, just in case. The woods were pitch black. Their phone flashlights cut thin tunnels through the fog which clung to the trees and ground alike. The air felt damp, heavy, like it pressed against their chests with every breath. They moved uphill slowly, careful with each step. That's when they heard it, a clicking sound. At first, it came from ahead, then from the sides, then all around them. Not insects, not animals. It was rhythmic, uneven, almost intentional. Neil whispered for them to turn off their lights. Don't let them know where we are. The moment the flashlights went dark, the clicking stopped. Silence rushed in to replace it, a thick, suffocating silence. They stood frozen, barely breathing. Then came movement, rustling, footsteps, close, and then a scream. Not an animal, not human either. Something raw, primal, full of rage and pain. The woods exploded into sound, running, stomping, coming straight toward them. They didn't think. They ran. My dad fired a flare behind them as they fled. For a split second, the forest lit up red, and that's when they saw them. More than 10 figures, maybe 15, dressed in dark, crude clothing. Some wore masks. Others had their faces smeared with something dark. They held wooden spears sharpened to points. They weren't chasing wildly. They were organized, hunting. Brian stumbled. Neil dragged him upright. They burst from the tree line back toward the water, screaming for Thomas to start the engine. The boat roared to life just as their pursuers reached the shore. My dad fired the last flare. The figures stopped, stood motionless at the water's edge, watching. When the flare burned out, the darkness swallowed them again. They didn't speak for nearly an hour. They drifted in silence, adrenaline slowly draining from their bodies. Walter woke up confused, drunk, and unaware of how close he'd come to dying. At dawn, the fog lifted. The cove looked normal, peaceful, like nothing had happened. They never went back. When my dad finished telling me the story, he stared at the floor for a long time. Then, he said something that still sticks with me. Some places don't want to be found. And some people don't want witnesses. I thought about the barrel, the man at my door, the footsteps in my house. I thought the nightmare had ended when he ran. But deep down, I knew better, because the water remembers. And whatever was hidden back then is still out there now. I wish I could say my father's story was the end of it, that hearing what happened to him all those years ago gave me closure, that it helped me put a name to the fear and leave it behind. It didn't. If anything, it opened a door. Because once you realize something like that exists, something patient, something hidden, you start noticing how often water pulls people toward it. The third story came to me months later from a man named Samuel Reed. He was nearly 60, retired, and lived alone in a quiet part of upstate New York. I met him by chance at a hardware store while replacing the last of my broken window panes. We struck up a conversation the way men do about tools, weather, and eventually fishing. The moment I mentioned lakes, his expression changed. He asked me where I liked to go. I told him I didn't fish anymore. He nodded slowly, like that made perfect sense. Then, without prompting, he told me why he didn't either. Samuel had been fishing his entire life, decades, on lakes and rivers across the state. He prided himself on knowing water, how it moved, how it sounded, how it felt when something beneath the surface wasn't right. That morning, he told me, was early April, just after the ice had broken, and before the season truly began. The lake he chose was small, nameless, and surrounded by forest on all sides. No houses, no docks, no signal. He arrived before sunrise and launched his kayak as the sky began to pale. The water was still glassy, reflecting the faint colors of dawn. He said it felt perfect, too perfect. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel noticed movement across the lake. 3 figures at the shoreline dressed in dark clothing, hoods pulled low. They were digging. At first, he assumed it was maintenance, or kids messing around. But something about the way they moved bothered him. Deliberate, quiet. When they finished, instead of placing something into the hole, they pulled items out, small at first, then larger, and one by one, they tossed them into the lake. Each splash echoed louder than it should have. Samuel felt fear hit him all at once. Not panic, not adrenaline, something deeper. A sense that he was witnessing the aftermath of something terrible. The figures left without looking back. Samuel waited. Then he paddled toward the spot. He fished the area for nearly an hour, trying to snag whatever had been thrown in. His hands shook the entire time. Finally, he remembered the depth checker in his car. When he returned, the line caught on something solid, metal. He switched to a larger hook and lowered it carefully. When he pulled it up, his breath left him in a sharp, involuntary gasp. A handgun, a black 9mm. He didn't touch it. He didn't look for anything else. He paddled straight to shore and called the police. They found more, a ring of keys wrapped in cloth, old foreign coins, and a small locket sealed tight by the water. The photos inside were too damaged to identify. The police never called him back. But that wasn't the end. A few nights later, Samuel heard voices outside his house, men, circling his yard. One of them said, "That's the car, I know it." They left without knocking. Samuel never slept right again. As he finished his story, he looked me straight in the eyes. "Water hides things," he said, "but it doesn't keep them forever." I drove home in silence, thinking about the barrel, the lake, the fog, the figures standing at the shoreline. I thought the nightmare had reached its peak, until I realized there was one more story, one that didn't end with survival. The last story didn't come to me through family. It came through guilt, because this one, I was there. It happened in the fall of 2022, back when I still believed bad things only happened to other people. At the time, I was going through one of those phases. You know the kind. You latch onto a hobby, obsess over it for months, then slowly let it fade. That summer, fishing was everything. About an hour's drive from where I lived, my family owned a small shore house. It sat right on the water, connected to a narrow lagoon that fed into the open ocean. There was an old Boston whaler, tied up out back, weathered but reliable. My friends and I spent most weekends there, fishing, drinking, pretending we were younger than we were. That October, after the crowds had thinned and the nights grew colder, 2 of my friends, Kevin and Aaron, suggested a weekend trip. Fall stripers were running, and Kevin swore he knew some perfect spots. The boat was out of commission, so we'd be fishing from shore. No big deal. At least that's what we told ourselves. We arrived Friday afternoon and fished a few piers along the inlet. The bite was slow. Only Kevin caught anything, and even that was small. By nightfall, we were restless. Kevin suggested a beach spot he knew about. Said it was quiet, hidden. A place you could fish all night without being bothered. The drive took us down a long, desolate road. woods on both sides. No streetlights, no houses, just darkness pressing in from every direction. We parked in what looked like a gravel lot. Kevin told us to bring everything. Chairs, coolers, rods. No going back to the car, he said. We're staying till sunrise. We followed a narrow path for about 5 minutes before it opened up into a massive empty beach. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of us, black and featureless. We set up camp, beach chairs, a speaker, 2 coolers. Kevin hammered rod holders into the sand and clipped bells onto the tips. The sound of the surf mixed with music and laughter. For a while it was perfect. Within 2 hours, we'd all caught fish. Decent ones, too. Spirits were high. Beers flowed. Then Aaron stopped talking. He lowered the music and tilted his head. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We laughed it off. "Hear what?" Someone yelled, he said, like, "Hey!" or "Yo." We told him he was imagining things, but none of us turned the music back up. A few minutes later, I noticed movement down the beach, a shape coming closer. We all saw it. A man, middle-aged, white, dark jacket, hat pulled low. He walked straight toward us. We shut off the speaker completely. When he reached us, he just stood there, staring at us, at the rods, at the water. 10 seconds passed. 15. Finally, he spoke. "What are you boys up to?" Kevin answered, trying to sound casual. "We're fishing." The man nodded once, grunted. Then he just stood there, watching. The bell on one of the rods jingled. I reeled in a small striper and held it up. "We got one," I said, mostly to break the tension. When I turned back, the man was gone. Just a duck silhouette retreating into the night. We all let out nervous laughs, convincing ourselves he was just some weird local. But we kept the music off. Not long after I heard it, a car alarm. Distant at first, then unmistakable. Mine. Panic hit us all at once. We ran, leaving everything behind. The chairs, the rods, the coolers. When we reached the lot, my stomach dropped. Slashed tires, shattered window. My wallet was gone. Cash from the glove box. Most of Kevin's gear. I called the police with shaking hands. While I was on the phone, we heard movement in the woods. Close, too close. We ran again, down the road into the trees, hiding and holding our breath, as the operator told us to stay quiet. 10 minutes later, police lights cut through the darkness. They searched the area and found a large knife lying nearby. One officer looked at us and said something I'll never forget. "You did the right thing, running. That man didn't just want to rob you." They drove us back to the shore house. We didn't sleep. I sold my fishing gear not long after that. Haven't touched a rod since. Now, years later, I think about all of it. The lake behind my house. The fog-choked cove my father escaped. The gun pulled from the depths. The man on the beach. Different places, different people, but the same pattern. Water. Isolation. Witnesses who weren't meant to see. Some things don't stay buried. Some people make sure of that. And sometimes, the water isn't what hides the truth. It's what marks you for finding it. I still live near the woods, still hear sounds at night. And every now and then, when the air is just right, I swear I can smell lake water where it shouldn't be. I don't fish anymore, but I still listen. Because once you've seen what waits near the water, you never really stop watching it back.